Okay, we're good to go. All right, thank you and welcome everybody. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's Planning Commission meeting. We have a special meeting tonight. We'll have a joint discussion with our Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee on our Shoreland Ordinance, Shoreland Management Ordinance revisions. I am Marty Dahl, Community and Economic Development Director for the City of Victoria. We are inching ever closer to having these meetings in person once again. In fact, we are hopeful that with using social distancing guidelines and some room capacity limits, we will be able to start holding our commission and committee meetings in person beginning as early as July. However, for tonight, with our large group of both planning commissioners and Lakes and Water Quality Committee members, we are still conducting our meetings remotely. A few housekeeping items related to that: during meetings like tonight that do not have a public hearing, comments should be sent to the Planning Commission or the Lakes and Water Quality Committee electronically via email or using our online form. That form can be found on our website at victoria.civicweb.net/portal at PMORETTO@ci.victoria.mn.us. Those of you watching us live online or on MediaCom Channel 8, please be aware of the following. We do have a quorum of both the Planning Commission and our Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee on the line for tonight's meeting. We are broadcasting this meeting live and are recording it so it can be viewed on demand. There is up to a 1-minute delay from the live meeting to the online or cable broadcasting commission by a roll call vote. And with that, I thank you, and I will turn it over to Chair Stensland to begin the meeting.
Thank you, Marty. I will now call this meeting to order. First, I would like to thank the members of Victoria's Lakes and Water Quality Commission Advisory Committee who are on this call to participate in our discussion on the city's Shoreland Management Ordinance. Planning Commission has a couple of short items of business to get to prior to our discussion, so please hang on the line, and we will open our joint discussion in just a couple of moments. So the first order of business tonight is to adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting. Members of the Planning Commission, before I ask for a motion, please state your name when moving and seconding. Commissioners, is there a motion to adopt the final agenda?
This is Laura. I motion to adopt the agenda.
Thank you, Commissioner Moore. Is there a second?
This is Commissioner Kuehne. I second it.
Thank you, Commissioner Kuehne. I have a motion made by Commissioner Moore, seconded by Commissioner Kuehne. I will now take a roll call vote, starting with Commissioner Brownlee. Brownlee?
Aye.
Thank you. Commissioner Kuehne?
Aye.
Thank you. Commissioner Gaur?
Can you hear me?
I can now. I'm reading your lips though now. It looked like an I, but I didn't hear it. So
Now, I don't
thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
We got it. Commissioner Iverson. One more time. Commissioner Iverson.
Chair Stensland, Commissioner Iverson is not online.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So we're going to jump over to Commissioner Pedersen.
Aye.
Thank you. Sorry for the confusion. Commissioner Moore.
Aye.
Thank you. Commissioner Schwarting.
Aye.
And Chair Stensland, aye. Thank you. The motion carries. Next item, approval of previous meeting minutes. This is from the meeting June 2nd, 2020, Planning Commission meeting. Again, members of the Planning Commission, before I ask for a motion, please state your name when moving and seconding. Commissioners, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
This is Commissioner Kuehne. I have an item that needs to be corrected under the item 2, approval of the minutes. It says motion carried 9-0. But Brownlee and Stensland were not at the meeting. Is that typical?
No, I think Paul or Marty, that should be corrected to state that, I know when I read through the minutes, it stated that myself and Commissioner Brownlee were absent, but I didn't see that. I missed it if it did say, that it was a full vote.
Chair Stensland, commissioners, you're correct. That would be an error in the minutes. We will make sure that gets corrected.
Okay, so I will repeat then with the corrected minutes. Do I have a motion to approve?
This is John Brownlee. I move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Commissioner Brownlee. Do I have a second?
Patterson, second.
I have a motion by Commissioner Brownlee, seconded by Commissioner Pedersen. I will now take a roll call vote. Commissioner Brownlee?
Aye.
Thank you. Commissioner Kuehne?
Aye.
Thank you. Commissioner Gaur?
Commissioner Gaur, aye.
Thank you. Commissioner Pedersen?
Aye.
Commissioner Moore?
Aye.
Commissioner Swarding?
Aye.
Chair Stensland, also aye. Thank you. Motion carries. We will now move to the discussion items tonight. There's only one item for discussion tonight, and that is item 3.1, Shoreland Management Ordinance discussion with Lakes Water Quality Advisory Committee. For those watching or listening to this meeting at home, please note there is no action being taken tonight. Commissioners and committee members, as just a reminder, please mute your microphones when you are not speaking to avoid background noise and feedback. I will now turn things over to staff to lead us through this presentation. Marty and Paul.
All right. Thank you, Chair Stensland. Thank you, Planning Commissioners and Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee members. We're going to do things a little differently for tonight's meeting. I have just a couple of slides for a prepared presentation. And then what I would like to do is actually pull up on our screen, and hopefully for those of you who have access to your packet, you can follow along if you'd like to see it in a little bit larger font. But I would actually like to walk through what is currently in the Redline draft ordinance for the Shoreland Management Ordinance, kind of section by section, just talking through why some of those red lines are there, answering any questions, discussing items that we feel need to be discussed. So I think tonight it'll be a little more free-flowing than we have typically done when we've been discussing these items where we've had some specific breakpoints for discussion. Feel free to jump in. I will try to pause as we go through as well to highlight some specific areas, but at any time as we are walking through this, feel free to jump in with any questions, comments, discussion items, things that you all feel you need to talk about further. So with that, I will go through just a couple of slides I have here. So just as a little bit of background as to where that draft Redline ordinance is today, based on the June 2nd Planning Commission, we had discussed several items that were in the previous version of the Redline and talked through a lot of those things, and with some of that feedback that had been received, as well as the discussion, we made a few significant changes to what were in the previous version that you'll see reflected in the current draft ordinance. The first of those being, as you'll recall, we had initially had a proposal on the table to make some adjustments to the DNR's PUD, residential PUD process that would reduce the amount of open space required for dedication when going the PUD route, and in exchange, having some required shoreline, 150 feet of shoreline dedication. Through the discussion and planning commission direction, we have reverted that back to the DNR's model language, which calls for that 50% open space. It does not have a required shoreline dedication, although it does require a percentage of that shoreline to be maintained as a natural area, whether that is through dedication or through an HOA covenant or what that is. So we'll talk through that in a little more detail when we get to that point. Also through discussion, we were directed to incorporate the current more restrictive Victoria Code language and requirements as it's related to lot area width and setbacks, to not have an opportunity where we end up with the current larger lots that are able to split and create almost double in density in some of those areas. And with that, there was some discussion and some interest of the commission to have those restrictions in place on our current city limit lakes, so all the lakes within current Victoria, but to explore the possibility of using those less restrictive DNR standards, again, nothing at those DNR standards for future growth area lakes. So you will see that reflected in the Redline ordinance as we go through that as well, and I'm sure that will be a point of discussion for the group. So as was noted in your background packet, staff has a few specific sections that we want to highlight as we go through this. But again, anything that you see or have had questions on, please stop us and we can talk about it. But some of the specific areas we're looking at for review are going through the definition section, talking about nonconformities, the land use section, the lot area and width standards, as I mentioned previously, placement, height, and design standards, vegetation management, stormwater management, as well as the planned unit development sections for both residential and commercial. And then also, as noted in your background report, there are some additional pieces that we really haven't discussed specifically as a planning commission that this might be a good opportunity to talk as a joint group. So some feedback from the Lakes and Water Quality Committee related to tree removal requirements, concerns about ag zoning and having runoff controls, maintenance of catch basins and ponds, and buffer area enforcement. So I'm going to stop sharing just for a second so I can pull up my screen that has the draft ordinance on it, and we can start walking through it. All right, is everybody seeing that document?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. So as we've discussed in both the commission and the committee meetings in the past, we took the approach of using the DNR's model ordinance as our baseline and redlining from there versus trying to take the city's existing ordinance and trying to incorporate sections and pieces of the DNR model. We thought that it would be a better practice to start with that DNR model and work from there. So that's what we've done, and that's what you're seeing, and that's what you've seen in your previous background packets. So as we kind of go through here, you'll see a lot of this stuff is just, some of the legalese, the statutory authorization and the policy that has been personalized for Victoria, our jurisdiction, which talks about which areas the city would have the authority to have the Shoreland ordinance in place. One of the red lines that we added into this was also for which the city has planning and zoning authority, because there is a potential that in the future the city could request planning and zoning authority over areas of the annexation area without actually annexing them. So in that case, we'd want these standards of the Shoreland ordinance to apply to any areas that we would have that planning and zoning authority. These two sections are struck out, and as noted here and was noted in the checklist document that was provided, we reverted back to city code, standard city code language on the penalty for violation and the severability section, just to make that consistent with city code. And that can be referenced in here as well, those code sections where those are applicable. So with that, we get down into the definitions, and the primary the primary red lines you will see in this definition section is, again, when we've already had an existing definition for something in our city code, in our general terms and conditions, and we wanted to have an identical definition within this section of the code is what our existing city code has, to avoid having confusion among definitions. Now, if there are city code definitions that you feel are not adequate, that's also a point that we can discuss, because there is potential that we could revise the general city code definition to better meet the needs. We'd want to ensure that it met the needs for Shoreland as well as any other issues, but that's a valid conversation point as well. So until you see any red lines, we are, again, working within the DNR's model definitions for all of these items as we scroll through. So the first definition that you'll come up that you'll see is modified is the commercial planned unit development. Shorelands, as we've discussed, we are requesting to have some flexibility for those commercial PUDs. The way that the DNR model is established for commercial PUDs, it's really more geared toward those resort type properties. So when they're looking at commercial, they're really talking more of those resort uses. So we wanted to make this more applicable to the city of Victoria, where our commercial planned unit development would be within our central business district. And we'll talk about commercial PUDs as we get farther along, but that's why you'll see that different definition there. Conditional use is one, again, that is in our existing definition, so we wanted to match those definitions. Same with deck, same as we get down to dwelling or dwelling unit. You'll see these two items, these definitions have been deleted. They are not applicable in Victoria. We have them listed in our land use section as non-allowable uses for forest land conversion or guest cottages. So those definitions have been removed. Building height or height of the building, again, is our city code definition, along with some figures that show that. The holding tank definition is a city code definition. Impervious surface or lot coverage is an existing city code definition, which is why you'll see that change there. We did want to revise the definition of clear cutting or intensive vegetation clearing, because through our tree preservation ordinance, we want to have a little more teeth in what we can allow or not allow when it comes to tree removal. So the DNR definition called clear cutting the complete removal of trees and shrubs. We wanted to take out the word complete, so that if there is any removal of trees or shrubs in a contiguous patch, strip, or row or block, that could be governed through our vegetation management and tree preservation ordinance as a clear cutting. Lot, also a city code definition along with lot width. The master site plan definition is a new definition that is related to our request for our commercial PUDs. Then we go through a number of definitions that are part of the DNR's model. We did have some discussion internally, and I'm not sure that this is the final definition of what a patio is, but the way that we handle planning and zoning, there is a clear definition between what a deck and what a patio is. A deck is typically and defined in our city code as being attached to a building. And there are a number of instances within this ordinance that talk about some of those detached deck patio type structures. So we did want to have separately defined deck and patio. And again, so this is a new definition, but is not necessarily the final definition. I think we're still working through some of that verbiage to make sure that it's consistent, but that was the reason for adding a new definition for patio. Non-riparian lot is also a city code definition that was added in. that actually provides at least some clarity as to what constitutes non-riparian. The DNR definition did not give a specific amount of feet, right? So you're potentially creating a loophole where someone could say, well, we've got this 5-foot strip of land that we're dedicating or doing something with, so we're non-riparian. We wanted to be very clear that you need at least 100 feet or greater of separation in order for that lot to be considered a non-riparian lot. Residential planned unit development. Again, we struck out some of these things about the condominiums, timeshares, cooperatives, more of that resort language that is not applicable in Victoria. Public waters is a city code definition. Riparian lot we defined farther up here. I think it's just out of order because we have it under lot riparian. Oh no, we've got it in this definition, sorry about that. So land that has shoreline that directly butts, again, that's a city code definition. Semi-public use, again, is something that's not applicable and not allowed, so that definition's been struck. Setback, some clarifying language, and then we have all of these that are DNR model definitions. Our steep slopes definition is one that I know prior to my arrival is something that the Planning Commission and Council had worked on quite a bit to put into place. So we wanted to make sure that we were using that city code definition for steep slopes, with the work that went into that. Structure, again, city code definition, variance, city code definition, wetlands, city code definition. So with that, before I move on, I will pause in case there are any questions, comments, or concerns related to any of the definitions as they are currently included. All right, hearing none, I will continue.
Excuse me, this is Dick Hawley. I did have a question. There was a piece that you skipped over quickly that had one you were talking about setbacks. It included sewage. Did it also include some language about wells, or are we looking at everything being connected to a sewage system?
Yeah, that is a good question. So it currently does not speak to wells. And I'm not sure of what the DNR standard is when it comes to wells, if they're looking for those to meet the same type of setback requirements. So that is a valid question that I'll have to do a little more asking about.
And is our presumption is that they would all have a connected sewer system?
Yes, so we do have, as we get down further into the code, there are specific setback distances for sewage systems for those non-sewered properties. Again, that is more applicable in our growth area in the township. I think the city's intention is that we would not want to allow development of non-sewered properties. You know, and within the city limits, we are working to try and get those properties connected. But we do need to have some sort of standard for those non-sewered properties, especially if we're getting that planning and zoning authority out in the township area where some of these may exist, and have those standards in place prior to development.
That would be my concern, especially if we're, coming into something that previously was agricultural or other type of zoning, and then we're going to look at what we're going to do from a residential standpoint, that we have some kind of controls initially and transition approaches.
Yes. Yeah, and that is how we handle all developments within the current growth areas and within the city as well, is that we would not allow. And you'll see when we get down to unsewered properties that we do have some language that limits the ability for people to create, if you want to call them unsewered developments. It's really meant to be applicable only to those true rural residential uses. Someone that has a farm home or something on a large piece of property that's out in the township area. But as that property develops, we would require connection to sewer.
Yeah, and I'm presuming that we may encounter some septic tanks and things like that that have to have additional
Correct.
setback or clearances.
Marty, Lance Fisher. Is there anything in this ordinance or in the general zoning ordinance that says that if a sewer is available, you must connect? In other words, preclude individual septic systems where there is sewer?
Yes, I believe we have that in our in the base ordinance somewhere, that if once sewer becomes available, there is a certain criteria or certain steps that need to be taken, that it needs to be connected in X amount of time. I will go back and confirm that, but I believe that we do have that language in place that requires sewer connection when sewer becomes available.
And would that also address either a new development or a new structure, new residential structure in a place where sewer is available? They would have to connect to the sewer.
Yeah, yes, and we do that now, whether it's development or if someone is tearing down a lot that is unsewered and building a new home on that lot, if that sewer is available, we would require them as part of that permitting process to connect.
Okay, so we don't need to add that here.
Yeah.
Well, Marty,
Yes.
this is Debbie Kraft. I have a question on the semi-public use definition. Wouldn't Mount Olivet Church be considered that a private nonprofit organization that provides a public service? I'm just wondering if that definition is relevant, that term.
So the way that we have seen this described within the ordinance, and you'll see the section that we've taken that out of as we go along, is that, and Paul, correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, is that it's really speaking to the use on public property that is then semi-public. I think most of those instances, like Mount Olivet that we would be discussing about, it would be considered private property, and they're working under private property. Am I interpreting that right, Paul?
Correct. Mount Olivet would be considered a nonprofit private.
Okay, thank you.
And as we get through the ordinance, you'll see the section where we pulled that out, and we can discuss further if we feel that needs to be included or modified. Any additional questions on the definitions? All right, so moving on, the next section then is really the administration of this ordinance. Again, a lot of this initial language is really just clarifying who is the administrative official, indicating the specific jurisdiction. Crossing out any of these statutes related to the counties, just for this municipality related things. Otherwise, this has primarily been left as the DNR model is written. We get down to 3.6 on conditional uses. In addition to the conditional use requirements of the DNR model, we also did want to reference the requirements of our Victoria zoning code on conditional uses. So we're not creating a situation where that is our general conditional use zoning is not applicable. Same as we get down into mitigation, we are using the DNR's language. It speaks to restoration of wetlands, limiting vegetation removal, evaluating those plans to construct sewage treatment, etc. And then we move into non-conformities. So as this is one of the areas that staff would like to highlight as well, we've had some discussions on this. As you'll recall, we were looking at a flexibility request to provide a little bit more flexibility on some of those non-conforming structures. This is language that currently exists in our Victoria Shoreland Management Ordinance. So essentially the DNR's model language is that all legally established nonconformities can continue but are managed according to Minnesota statute, subdivision that relates to alterations, additions, expansions. That gets into a lot of detail as to what can and can't be done. I think the idea would be that we still would revert to those Minnesota statutes on these things, but we also wanted to have some conditions that would allow for a little bit of additional flexibility. The first of them being that folks that were looking to do an expansion to the outside dimensions of their existing non-conforming structure, that they must meet the setback height and other requirements within this ordinance, and that they are they're able to do that expansion if they can meet these current conditions. And again, this is in our existing Victoria Shoreland code, that it would not further reduce the setback from the ordinary high water line. So an expansion couldn't be towards the water. An expansion couldn't increase the height beyond what is allowed. An expansion could not go beyond what the side yard setbacks are. And then that the expansion could also not exceed the allowable impervious surface standards in that area. So if a lot is maxed out on its 25% impervious surface, that expansion would not be allowed. Essentially, this would be applicable for homes on wide lots, non-conforming homes on wide lots that have side yard ability and that are not maxed out on their impervious, to be able to do some of those side yard expansions. I do not know how many cases of this there are within the city, but I do know that this was language that was existing in our current ordinance. And then the second piece of that, before I stop and we can talk through it more if needed, is, as we've discussed previously, the condition in our ordinance that talks about the tear down and rebuild of non-conforming structures in their non-conforming footprint. This language again says that that is allowed, and it is currently allowed by the city, that if you tear down a house that is non-conforming, a new home can be built in that same footprint, non-conforming footprint, as long as it is not any closer than 50 feet from the ordinary high water level. And then there is a calculation that reduces the height and the side yard setbacks, essentially limiting the size of that structure based on how much it exceeds the required ordinary high water line. So with that, I will open that up to any questions or discussions, and if this is something we still are wanting to move forward with.
Yeah, this is Dick Hawley again. In one of the earlier meetings, we had discussions not just about the setback from water, but also about elevations. Is there another section here that deals with elevations in comparison to ordinary high water levels?
So there is no building allowed within any existing floodplain, and that actually is would be referenced in this statute. That's part of the Minnesota statute, that if there is a floodplain, there's no building allowed within a floodplain.
Floodplains defined by whom?
The FEMA mapped areas. So if it is a FEMA mapped
okay, but FEMA has
floodplain,
not mapped all of the areas, as I understand it, within our city at this point.
That is correct. That is correct.
So is there now an existing definition that we can append to the FEMA board?
A definition for floodplain?
Yes. If there's not a FEMA definition, what are we going to use?
Sure.
And then I'm presuming that if there's some kind of controversy surrounding this, that we would go through the standard FEMA repeals and so forth to try to get their approval.
Mm-hmm.
Is is that listed in here in terms of how that's?
No,
how this could be
No,
computed?
so we have not gotten into that level of detail currently,
Okay.
but I am taking notes. Any other questions, comments related to the non-conformity section?
Lance Fisher here. I got a couple. 3.6 conditional use. Go back to it here. Okay, on the, it's like 3.64. We talked about this in a couple of our water quality meetings. I believe we were in agreement, but it's certainly my opinion that there should be some language that states that the impact should be limited to the equivalent impact of the conforming use. In other words, if you want to get a conditional use permit to do something, the impact of that should be comparable to a conforming use of a repair in lot in a residential setting, if that's what it is.
Yeah, and based on our discussion as well, we do have, as we move forward, we do have that addressed when it relates to those controlled access lots. So I know that that was a point of concern about making sure that a controlled access lot would be the comparable standards to what a single lot would be. So that will be another piece we'll be able to talk through once we get there.
But do you think it might be appropriate to have a similar constraint here in 3.64?
Yeah.
It says compatible, which is pretty wide open. I think a little more clarity there would help.
Yep. I've got that noted.
Okay. And then on, let me just run down here, 3.1, I had a question, but I think you might have answered it. I'll state the question anyway. Is it, it's not clear to me that the expansion, what the requirements are here, if it, let's take an example of where a structure is closer to the ordinary high water mark than the current zoning allows, but they want to expand laterally so that the expansion will also be closer to the ordinary high water mark than the zoning allows. Is that to be allowed here? In other words, does the expansion have to meet the requirements, or does it simply have to not go any further, any closer than the existing structure?
The way it is written in our current ordinance, which is relayed here, our interpretation would be that it would not be able to go any closer, but it would be able to maintain that non-conformity.
Okay, so you could have a small structure that's close, you know, some portion of the structure is closer to the ordinary higher water mark, and they want to just expand that out to have a wider footprint that's closer. Is that
correct? Yeah, that's the way we would interpret the way it's currently written.
I'm not clear on this in my head yet, but that may be undesirable. I think that might merit some further discussion at some point.
Yeah, and again, I think as a piece of this, staff has not done this exercise yet, but some of these items such as this, we need to do just an inventory as to is this even a relevant clause, right? I mean, do we even have these conditions existing currently?
I agree.
How many?
Yeah, I agree. I actually had intended to, but best laid plans and how that goes. Take a look at the GIS plats around the recreational development lakes that have been developed to see what the lot widths are and where the structures are. But I think it would be very beneficial if that data was available.
Right.
Okay, and then I'm trying to move on quickly here to 3.83, which is, okay, what was my concern here? Setback from shore. Oh, okay. Yeah, in 3.83, you have an encroachment limit of, you know, a minimum of 50-foot setback, but this doesn't differentiate between the different types of lakes, and it seems like that number should be higher for the recreational, for the natural environment lake.
Sure. I think that's a valid point. Again, this was language that's currently existing, so it was pulled over from the current ordinance. But I think that's a valid point of discussion if we feel this is something we want to make accommodations for, but want to have some greater restrictions based on lake classification.
Okay, that's it for me.
Marty, this is Debbie
Hey,
Kraft.
Marty.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Debbie.
Okay, I have a question kind of bouncing off of Lance's comment and our discussion at the last Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee meeting regarding the conditional use. And I think Lance's comment was that the conditional use should not have any more impact than the standard zoning. However, there was great discussion and a lot of work done with Waterford Landing, and the understanding was that further conditional use permits or CUPs that were done in Patio developments would not have any further impact than what Waterford Landing does. So that's less impact than single family homes would be. And I think we'll probably get to that later in the discussion.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any other questions, comments before I move on? All right. So section 3.9 really just speaks to the notifications of the DNR, outlines when and who needs to be notified when things are happening based on their model ordinance. The language here about the environmental assessment worksheet, again, DNR model ordinance language. So then we move into section 4.0, which is the shoreline classification system and land uses. So what we have done here is made sure that the current lakes are noted, as well as those 5 lakes that would be within our future annexation area, again, just so that they are encompassed at any point in time that we either annex or get planning and zoning authority, so that we do not need to make a modification to this lake list in the future. And then we also have a handful of tributaries that are defined as tributaries that also fall into the shoreline ordinance classification as well. And you'll see as we continue through, we've got different standards and things that are set for those tributaries. And then these are all removed as they are not applicable. We don't have any of those. So then we move into the land use section, and this is one I think I'd like to spend a little bit of time on as well. So as I scroll down, you'll see we've got that table that indicates which land uses are permitted, conditional, and not allowed. Essentially, the red lines in this section have clarified the fact that a conditional use within a shoreland will not be allowed unless it's allowed within underlying zoning. We don't want to create a situation where someone is able to have a conditional use because they're in the shoreland and it's governed a little bit differently. That would not typically be allowed in a R1 district, for example. So that's just some clarifying language. But the piece that we would like to see if there's any questions, comments, or feedback on is this list of land uses. So essentially, these are the different areas, different land uses that could potentially take place in these shoreland areas. And this table is meant to identify whether that's a permitted use, conditional use, or a not allowed use. You'll see we made a few changes or edits to what the DNR model had. The single family residential, again, in any residential area would be a permitted use with adhering to the standards. As you'll see when we get down to the section on the lot width and area, part of our discussion was having some set of standards for those multifamily homes. So we have included some new language there. Again, this is based off of our current city ordinance, which has those standards available for recreational development and natural environment lakes and as permitted uses for duplex. And then as well as our general development lakes have those as conditionals. And actually, I have in a version that I have since been tinkering with since I sent this, I actually split this out. So I had duplex as its own line, which was then conditional, permitted, and then triplex, quad, or above, where it was conditional all the way across the board. So we've already kind of thought through the way that that's written below, but we can discuss that further as well. So any questions with any of these uses?
Yeah, Dick Holly, can you explain the piece there on the, as an example, I'm looking at the agricultural with feedlots, cropland first, then there's feedlots new, and then there's feedlots expansions. Can you explain to me thinking process on that?
Yep. So this is, these are all governed through state statute. So state statute does not allow any new feedlots in shoreland areas. So a feedlot cannot be created, but it does have some protections for those existing feedlots. And so that by the statute or per the statute, there is a conditional use process that can be done for expansion or resuming that existing use. So that's really all predicated by state statute. Similarly to this mining of metallic minerals and peat, again, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a permitted use in these areas by state statute when there are those conditions in place. So that's why it's noted as a permitted use.
I'm sorry, but I really don't understand the situation where you would expand a feedlot within a natural environment. So is there room in this for making changes?
I think we'd have
make
to
sense. That's what
Yep.
we'd want to do if we're doing an annexation with the long-term idea that we're going to do residential, and then we're going to turn around with the problems that may come about for for feedlots near, for water quality purposes.
No, totally understand. I think what we need to determine is what those state protections are, right? There may be some state protections on those things that we cannot supersede, but we can certainly look into that.
Marty?
Yeah.
This is Paul. And so I think some of this does have to do with the idea that in our annexation agreements, the townships have the ability to do a take all now clause. And so, it's possible that we may take in all of Lake Town Township at one point that includes certain uses outside. I don't know if they exist like on Lake Turbid or on Mud Lake, I'm not sure. But it's something that we need to think about if those conditions exist where we're not necessarily annexing them as a part of a development, but because it's forced annexation through the annexation agreement.
So I've got that added to my list of notes that we'll do a little more digging. Again, I agree with you. I think if we can permit or prohibit that type of use, especially in those areas, but really in any shoreland, I think that would likely be something we'd be interested in looking at. But I do want to make sure that what the state statute says, and if that's something that we're unable to supersede when it comes to those existing uses.
Marty, Lance here. I would ask that you take a look at the same issue regard to mining metallic minerals and peat. If we can prohibit it in the shoreline areas, I think that would be wise.
I'll do that.
Yeah, if either not, I guess prohibit's the wrong term. Make it require a conditional use permit so that the issue can be analyzed and
fully vetted,
protected. Yep.
All right. Anything else related to the land uses, questions, concerns, comments? and again, of course, with all of these items, none of this, we've still got several rounds that we'll be discussing this. So if something wakes you up in the middle of the night, feel free to shoot me a note, and we'll incorporate that into future discussions as well. And so then essentially this is the same table, same conditional permitted and not permitted for those tributary areas. So we will any changes we're able to make with some of these other items, we will make within that area as well. So moving on to 5.0, this is our special land use provision.
Excuse me, this is Dick, and just one other aspect of that. Within our conditional permitting, do we have any guidelines that, or are we just leaving it wide open from a conditional standpoint? Are there any guidelines that we can set for these specific lake classifications in terms of what some of our requirements might be from a water quality perspective?
So as you'll recall, there are some existing already within the ordinance. If we go up to, was that in the definition or was that was down here farther? Sorry, I'm not trying to make you all dizzy. We talked about conditional. So in the current DNR model, their standards include the prevention of soil erosion or other possible pollution of public waters, both during and after construction, visibility of structures and other facilities viewed from public waters, that there's adequate water supply and on-site sewage treatment, and that the types, uses, and numbers of watercraft, as we talked about. So those are some existing standards, and then we also have some standards within our section 31 on conditional uses. But if we do determine that some of these items could be changed from permitted to conditional, if we're able to do that, we can certainly look at, do we need to put in some additional standards into the ordinance for those specific conditional uses?
And we can put those in based on the lake classification. So if you have a natural lake, we could handle that differently than we would for another classification.
Yeah, I mean, we can put whatever we want into the ordinance, right? That's legally allowable if we determine we're legally able to do that. It would just be a matter of getting DNR buy-in on any of those additional clauses. Again, if they are more protective, my guess is that they would be okay with that. But yeah, certainly. I mean, we can, as long as it is legal, we can include it.
I'm just thinking that we already have, a known problem with what's coming with runoff off of dairy land right now into a lake, and one that we're considering putting a park and other things. And there's not been a good job of, controlling what's going on there from a water quality standpoint over the years. So trying to look at how do we control it as a city as we look at our old zoning and permitting process.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good point. All right, so let me get back to so our special land use provisions area, again, this is some of those special land uses for commercial, industrial, and public use standard. This is one of those areas where we had removed the semi-public use standards. Again, because we're looking at that as it's either fully public, or if it is not fully public, it is private property. But this section speaks to water dependent uses that may be located on parcels or lots with frontage on public waters, and some of those standards of incorporating topographic and vegetative screening, uses that require short-term watercraft mooring for patrons must centralize these facilities. And again, this is not a blanket approval on those types of things. This would be if through a PUD or a conditional use permit or something that would be vetted through a use like that was allowed, it provides some of those standards that would need to be met in those cases. But this would not be, this section does not give blanket approval for those types of uses. And we did take out the area here about the commercial uses that are in a commercial district requiring that double frontage, because as we've talked about, we're looking at addressing our one commercial district through a revised or some flexibility with that commercial PUD section. The next section is agricultural use. And the only change that we've made here again is a reference to our uses that are described in our current zoning code. So anything that would be zoned ag would have to adhere to our existing ag zoning district as well as these additional standards. Here is where we get a little bit more information on those feedlot issues. So where it states that new feedlots are not allowed in Shoreland, and talks about some of those Minnesota statutes. And as I mentioned, we'll dig into that a little deeper to see what our ability is on those items. As we noted in the definitions area, the forest management, so harvesting of timber, is we've got noted as a not allowed use, as well as these extractive use standards. So we've struck those because they're not going to be an allowed use. So we don't need any of those conditions. And then there are some state statutes that relate to metallic mining. So again, that's part of that other question that we have with what we can or can't do with the mining. Any questions on that area? So as we get into 6.0, we've got a few sections in here for to highlight and discussion. So again, starts out with just the purpose, and then the lot area and width standards. Some of those conditions, only lands above the ordinary high water line level can be used to meet those standards, and that lot widths are to be met at both the ordinary high water line and at the building line. Again, that is a condition to try and preclude some of those, you know, providing everybody with a small water access, that the width needs to be the same at the building line and at the water. In 6.23, this is really just a clarification that when we're saying for sewer, that can only be used if publicly owned sewer system service is available. And again, just a clarification outlined in this section. So when we get into this 6.2 and the tables below, this was based on our last Planning Commission meeting on June 2nd, where we discussed the idea of wanting to have our current code standards in place for all of the current city limit lots, and potentially providing the DNR standards for those lakes that are in our development area. So what we've done here is we've made some modifications to the current red line that speaks to what calls out what those developed lakes are, and this list should be inclusive of all the lakes currently within city limits. And then for the purposes of determining what we're coining as undeveloped lakes, we've included the list that I believe encompasses all of the lakes that would be in our growth area. The other addition up here is language from our existing code language related to unsewered properties. As we were looking at these tables and how do we address these items, again, as we've discussed earlier, our intent is to really try to limit and prohibit unsewered properties. And as we're looking at the existing city code language, it feels like we've got some good verbiage in place that makes that very restrictive on how unsewered properties can be developed. So we've plugged that language in there for now and eliminated the specifics within the table, as these would be applicable to all of the lakes within this paragraph. Before I move into the tables, any questions on either this unsewered properties paragraph or what we were trying to do here with the separation?
Just one quick comment. Zumbrasani is officially a single lake. They are not two different lakes. They're two different bays of a single lake as defined by the DNR.
Okay. And they're both listed separately here. When we look at our lake.
Yeah, you can make a note and kind of catch that on other things later, but.
Sure. 'Cause I feel like for some reason we had them as separate lake classifications too, but maybe I'm making that up. So Zumbra, recreational, and yeah, Sunny here is noted as natural environment, but they're classified as the same by the DNR. Yeah, okay, I see that there.
Marty, Lance here. Just one question about the first 6.2X paragraph. I'm confused. It sounds like it says for unsewered properties, in the shoreline zone has to be at least 1 acre. And then right after it says for lots of record in unsewered areas, the minimum lot size is 5 acres. That seems conflicting.
Yeah, and we've talked about this internally too, and Paul, I think we've determined it, and this paragraph probably needs to be clarified if we determine this is the way we want to go, but Paul, I believe that we believe that the 5 acres is the minimum lot size to allow it to be split to a 1 acre parcel. Is that what we had discussed?
Yeah, I think there's some thought process behind that in order for you to have that minimum set, in order to split, you'd have that 5 acres would be that cutoff.
So in that scenario or that interpretation, if you had a 4 acre lot, you would not be able to subdivide that as unsewered.
Okay, that applies to unsewered. Okay, that makes sense. But it doesn't say that.
No,
You're
it doesn't, and that if we like this approach, that paragraph needs some massaging, definitely.
Okay.
Hi, Marty, this is Debbie Kraft. I don't have that, everything after 6.24, so 6.2X. That's not in my copy. It is, that I think I printed out in the packet the other day. So I'm just wondering if that's a newly added thing since the last week, or?
No, this is the updated version that should have gone out with the most recent packet that came out on Friday morning.
Okay, I must have printed it prior to that. I'm sorry. I'll look at the.
Yeah, and I believe Alyssa, I think did you send out an email to everybody with that link again to the updated packet?
Yep.
Okay. So Debbie,
Yeah,
you should have just gotten
it. So I apologize. Yeah, sorry about that.
So yeah, let us know if you need us to clarify anything as we're going through. Hopefully you can see what we're showing on the screen. So then if we move into this table area, again, this is incorporating those existing standards for our developed lakes as we're defining as those city limit lakes, which are our current standards for general development, as well as recreational development and natural environment lakes. So you're seeing these are all identical to what is currently included in our current ordinance as far as lot area and lot width for both riparian and non-riparian. One point that I think requires some discussion as well is, so we were looking at these standards for duplex, which is something we haven't really talked about yet in any of our previous meetings as we're looking at updating this table. If we are to pull the standards exactly as they are in our current ordinance, again, single family are all either at or above DNR standards, but when we're looking at duplex, they are either at or below, outside of lot area. So some of the lot areas, as you can see with these red lines, are above. So what I had done in this red line version is actually include those DNR standards for the lot width in any of those areas where our current ordinance was under DNR standard for duplex. So what you are seeing in these lakes that we are listing duplex standards, these are from the DNR, and actually the existing City of Victoria ordinance has some lower standards in some of those areas. So just a point of clarification, and if discussion is needed on that. I'm not sure why, and in fact, I had gone back and forth as to whether the intent on that was meant to be, if you have a duplex, they're counting each side of the duplex as a lot, and those standards needed to be met for each side, but that didn't necessarily, the math didn't add up with that. So for these purposes, for duplexes, I did include the DNR standards, which were higher in many cases. And then before I stop again for discussion, we did then just create some additional tables that would show those slightly less restrictive standards for those future growth area lakes, as we had discussed at the Planning Commission meeting. So for recreational development lakes, looking at the DNR standards of the 20 and 15 with the 80-foot width, and with the natural environment, looking at that acre and 150 for riparian. And then we have still included that current flexibility request for these lakes of reducing the, lot area and lot width on those natural environment lakes in the undeveloped areas. But again, that I think is open to discussion and looking for consensus on what the commission and committee thinks should be done with those. So I know this one's a pretty broad topic, but would pass it back over for discussion, comments, questions.
Well, my only comment, Lance Fisher here, is that it looks like you've done pretty much exactly what we were asking for, which is a good thing. Oh, I know, I did have a question. When we first talked about having two separate sets of requirements, there was some concern that that might not be legal. Have you researched that aspect of it?
Yeah, so I actually had a conversation with the our DNR representative this morning, just on some of the broader area questions and things that we've discussed in the last few meetings. And at least from a initial conversation, they didn't seem to be overly concerned with having some separation on what those standards were, if those lakes are clearly defined and listed. And again, of course, they're looking to make sure that things are adhering to at least their standards. So at least on first blush from speaking to the DNR, it didn't sound like there was a big issue, but they are, once we've kind of buttoned this up a little bit more, we'll be getting them the updated information and asking for some more formal feedback on this. Any other questions, comments on lot width or area? So one of the other items that we've got some proposed differing language is when it comes to those tributaries and how we handle lot area and width along those tributaries. So essentially, most of those tributaries are within an existing shoreland district, so within that 1,000 feet of a lake. So what we're stating here is that if that tributary is within the shoreland district, that it needs to adhere to those same standards as the shoreland district. And then if it is outside of that shoreland district, that it would just revert back to underlying zoning as far as the lot area and lot width requirements.
Just to be clear, you're saying that riparian lots along a tributary that are not within the 1,000-foot shoreland zone of a lake don't have any additional requirements beyond the normal zoning requirements. Is that correct? Yeah,
I mean, that's the way it is currently written, correct. And we've again, because these tributaries are not really quite rivers, they're more of the creek type things. That's how we got there. But
Does
again,
the DNR have any requirements for tributary riparian lots?
We haven't asked them, or I didn't when I talked to them today, ask them specifically about this section. So it will certainly be something that if they have concern or if they have some specific requirements for tributaries that they want to make sure are met, that we'd get with that feedback when they provide it. But I did not ask them specifically about this section today when I talked to them.
I would think that the lot width probably isn't a big, huge deal, but if we have any tighter constraints for pervious surface or because that's the main one, and maybe setback from the ordinary high water mark, those might want to be requirements for at least some named tributaries. Those tributaries, from a water quality perspective, end up being virtually identical to riparian shore because we don't have any treatment coming into the water bodies, and that's where those tributaries feed from those tributaries.
No, good point. I've got it on my list, and I'll seek some additional feedback on that from the DNR.
Is there a listing here of where wetlands are handled?
No, so we've got a definition for wetlands, and based on our other practices, and I'm not sure, Paul, maybe you could state if that's in the existing ordinance. Protected wetlands are unbuildable. I'm not entirely sure where that is governed, if that's within our city ordinance or if that's within the watershed district. Paul, how do we typically handle that? I know they're unbuildable.
Right, yeah, they're unbuildable. If it's a subdivision, we require that it's dedicated to the city. So there's a lot of provisions that stop a person from doing that. I know, I think there's even beyond the city, there's, state and federal requirements for wetlands as well, depending if it's classified.
I was looking at things like setbacks and things like that we typically would have in our building ordinances.
Yeah, we have, there are wetland mitigation areas. I'd have to defer to the watershed district with how we go about regulating those, but they're pretty stringent. Like you can't get close to those fixed bodies.
Do we have any specific listings as to how we want wetlands to be regulated and administered? I would think we would want some section to do that.
Or does Victoria simply leave that to the watershed and follow their rules?
I know in practice, at least in my time here, that has been what we have done, is we've relied on the watershed to provide us their guidance and standards when it's related to that. So I am not entirely sure if within our ordinance somewhere we have any specific requirements related to wetlands. Again, something I can check on, but yes, you're right. In practice, we've typically deferred that to the watershed.
I don't know if this is unique to Shoreland or not, but it might be worth having some language in some part of the zoning ordinances that pretty much states that any development has to meet the watershed requirements, watershed district requirements, just so that you don't end up with somebody saying, well, you covered everything else and you didn't say you couldn't do this, so you can. There's a, I don't know, I don't remember how this handoff works, but by developing some of your own requirements, you can supersede what the watershed's doing, and somebody might be able to do something more egregious than they could have if they were following the watershed's rules.
Right, and I know we always include that as a requirement in any development agreement, but Paul, do you know if we specifically state that in our subdivision ordinance? If it's written in ordinance about the requirement to adhere to all the watershed district standards?
It's a good question. I know when you do a new build or when you're doing a subdivision, you have to get a permit from the watershed district, and so that binds you to the rules.
Right. So yeah, we'll look into that. I'm not exactly sure if our subdivision speaks specifically to that. As I said, in practice, we do that, and it's included in every development agreement. But you're right. There's validity if we're doing that should be ordinance if it is not in there. And I agree, it's beyond just shoreland because wetlands are part of pretty much every development, whether within shoreland or not.
And we're so interconnected here and, dependent on the wetlands from what goes on from a water quality standpoint, because everything is flowing down through the watershed. And so I think we should be a little more specific in terms of how we're going to regulate this.
Yeah, this is Debbie Kraft. I'm looking at that tributaries thing too and thinking it seems like a loophole for somebody, if there's not some kind of consistent along with the lake restrictions or guidelines, that somebody could just dredge out that tributary and you lose that, the filtration that those tributaries provide. Someone just creates a big lane for coming through with their with boats or whatnot. It seems like that there should be some restrictions in that language. It doesn't seem protective to me. Maybe I'm reading it wrong.
No, I have that noted. I will add that to my list to look for some further DNR guidance on that. Anything else with lot width areas? So you'll see here, this is another provision that was pulled over from our current Shoreland ordinance, which requires that reconstruction for non-conforming systems whenever an expansion or addition of a bedroom or bathroom is proposed or a variance for the property is required. So this again, I think is one of those pieces that helps require connection to sewage treatment. So if you've got a non-conforming system, if you've got a sewage treatment or a sewage system versus connected to city sewer, there's some language that requires if you come in for a building permit that we can require connection if that connection is available.
Not sure if this is covered here somewhere already, or if this is the right place, but I think it is common in a lot of areas that if your septic system needs to be rebuilt, in other words, if it's failed and doesn't operate properly, that it has to be rebuilt according to the latest requirements, and or if there is sewer available, you have to connect the sewer.
Mm-hmm. And
in other words,
as we
pretty close to what you're saying here for expansion, but I'm saying even if it is an expansion, if it's just a replacement due to a failure of a system.
Right, and I believe we address that within our code outside of Shoreland, just again because it is applicable outside of that. I've got that on my list as well, just to confirm that we are addressing that, but I believe we do address that within the code.
Okay. And in that addressing it would require on a rebuild that it be done according to the shoreland, so new shoreland ordinances requirements.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're essentially creating an overlay district, right, with the shoreland management. So those provisions stack on top of each other, and you're always required to follow the most restrictive standard for any of those overlays. So moving on then, 6.3, this is some DNR language about some special provisions when it comes to duplexes, triplexes, and quads on natural environment lakes. Again, we are proposing that anything beyond a duplex would need to go through a PUD process, so would require even additional standards to what is listed here. But in the case of a duplex, which would be allowed if duplexes are allowed in the underlying zoning, that there are some additional standards on those natural environment lakes for duplexes. But again, anything beyond that, we are looking at requiring going through the PUD process, which would have some additional standards.
Is it clear from this that if someone did go through the PUD process, that they would still have to meet these requirements, that they wouldn't get an exclusion from this by doing the PUD?
I don't know if we have that nexus called out within here when we get down to the PUD section, so we certainly can refer back to this section for natural environment. I don't know if we currently have that in here.
Okay, well, we get to the PUD part.
All right. And then again, this is just a overhanging letter D here for those natural environment lakes, about the shoreline not being only 25% of a lake shoreline being able to be that really high intense use at maximum. So as we move on to 6.32, we are talking about accessory structures, and I think the conversation at our last planning commission was that we felt there was validity to having those accessory structures allowed on all lakes, and that they could be in addition to the allowed accessory structures for a given lot that's in our current ordinance, which we are referencing here. We've got the design standards a little bit further down, so we can take a look at that as we get there. But essentially, this is saying that if you're within a shoreline district, you're allowed one additional water-oriented accessory structure in addition to what is allowed through the current accessory structure zoning code.
One thing that I thought of when we talked about it before that I never brought up, you've got a maximum size here, but it may be desirable to also have a maximum width of that shoreline accessory structure relative to the shoreline itself. It's mostly an aesthetic thing, but I think most of the residents of the lake would agree that if somebody builds a 30 by 10 foot, 300 square foot building, it would be much better oriented with the 10 foot
narrow,
parallel to the lake. So I would suggest that the way to stipulate that is just to have some maximum width in addition to the maximum square area.
Got that noted. So as we move down here, we've got a number of sections and subsections here that we are, again, just deferring to the DNR model language. We did make a modification to controlled access lots. As we've discussed, we'd want those to be conditional uses, either through development process or a conditional use process, so that it can be vetted and there is public feedback. We also did want to clarify that these would be privately owned controlled access lots, because the city is not necessarily interested in having a controlled access lot that is not applicable or open to all of the public. If the city were to do anything within a shoreline, it would be a park. So just some clarification that this controlled access lot is really a privately owned controlled access lot. And this is where we've talked about, I mentioned that there were some standards for those controlled access lots and the impact that they can have. So the DNR model language is that lot must meet the area and width requirement for a residential lot, be suitable for the intended uses. And then it does talk about docking, mooring, or over water storage. If there's going to be more than 6 watercraft allowed, then the width of the lot, keeping the same lot depth, must be increased by a percentage of the requirements for riparian residential lots for each watercraft beyond So it's kind of giving a calculation here as to how that would be determined. Again, up to a maximum width of whatever the lot width allowed in the development for residential lots. So it does limit the number of watercraft that can be moored based on the size of that controlled access lot.
And Marty, this is Debbie Kraft. I'm looking at that and thinking again back to Waterford Landing and the standards that were set and the understanding that all of us had with Waterford Landing that would sort of be the standard upon which these types of situations would happen in the future. Waterford Landing is allowed one boat, one dock for the homes, and it has, I think, 80 feet of, I think, approximately 450 to 500 feet of lakeshore that is allowed for that single lot. When I look at this and I think 6 watercraft in a conditional use lot like this, it seems excessive. I mean, if this is for general development lakes, perhaps, but if I'm looking at recreational lakes, seems 6 is extremely high.
Others' thoughts?
Marty, this is Ann Helscher. I think somewhere else in this proposed ordinance, there's a reference to the LMCD managing docks on Lake Minnetonka. Would it be appropriate to also put a note in this section that references that with respect to, it's just docks, not anything that happens on the land, but the LMCD would govern dock use on Lake Minnetonka only?
Yes. Yep, we can do that.
This is Dick. Did we have at one point here, a limitation in terms of the number of watercraft based on an equivalent number of residential lots that would be there if it was not, not the multi-living quarters?
Yeah, I thought that's what we had discussed, that in other words, if your riparian length was equivalent of 5 lots, you could conceivably have up to 5 boats on a dock. But this description you have here for a recreation development lake, I think is likely to be excessive.
Yeah, and so I think this requires some additional discussion and direction. Essentially, what we've done here is taken the DNR model language, which is sounding like may not necessarily work for us, which is limiting that size of a controlled access lot to the size of a residential lot, and then allowing some additional storage of or mooring of boats on docks. What I'm hearing, at least from a few folks and interested in others to chime in, is that there may be some thought of allowing larger controlled access lots, but then limiting the ability of how many boats can be docked or moored there to 1 per what a standard lot would be.
That's kind of what we had in mind. I would also suggest that you differentiate between powered and non-powered. The canoes, kayaks, and small sailboats don't pose the same kind of recreational impact that powerboats do.
Right, Marty. This is Randy Drew. So I share the sentiment that you had noted. That we may want to provide more access, but not necessarily large moorings of boats on these small recreational lakes.
The other concern we expressed, and I think we had some discussion on, was that if you had a developer that had property in close proximity, that could be a problem if he's tried to use this for being able to open up kind of his own private access to the lake for for something that's non-adjacent to the properties we're talking about. So we discussed limiting the number of watercraft to an equivalent number of watercraft you'd have if you did these all as lakeshore lots.
And I would, and Dick and Lance have both said equivalent to what lakeshore lots were. And I think the discussion was that it would be less than a lakeshore lot would be, that it would be, if a developer is allowed to have the density that is 3 times what this typical density is, you're going to have those people going down to the lake and using it, and there should be a more protective shoreline standards than a single lot. So again, I go back to Waterford Landing and the standard that was set there, that the interpretation of most people on Schuetz Lake was that would be the standard set moving forward. And so that standard is that they have 80 feet of shoreline that was developed, and they have 1 dock with 1 boat with 32 homes. The rest of that shoreline was left for natural habitat. And so I think to say that you could put 5 homes worth of docks at Waterford Landing is not in the spirit of the PUD or the give and take that PUD has. You have 32 homes where 17 could be. So they get 1 dock for 32 homes and 80 feet of shoreline. The rest of it is protected of natural habitat. So five or 6 docks and 6 boats that are motorized, as Lance said, I think would be abuse of the land.
Yeah, this is Randy Cheryl. I do remember that conversation and do concur with that. That was the sentiment.
I don't want to get to be overly restrictive here. I do see a difference between shared watercraft and owned watercraft. That is, if you had 20 homes that were associated with a particular controlled access lot, and they had some mechanism that allowed some of those homeowners to keep a boat, that wouldn't have the same impact as, the concern at Waterford Landing was it was a shared boat or shared multiple boats. And at that point, you have the potential for a lot more use. If you've got 40 people and 3 boats, that's a whole different amount of impact than 4 homes and 4 boats. But if the boats are individually owned, then that issue isn't as concerning to me. I do think that maybe there are also, I don't know how you would craft this, but it's certainly worth looking into, something that precludes what Dick was talking about, and that is somebody might buy up some land nearby, set up a development, and then buy 1 lot on a lake and essentially make a whole bunch of lakeshore out of those lots in terms of their use of the lake. That's probably the biggest concern. And I've seen it done in other places, so it's not unheard of. I don't know that it's going to happen in Victoria, but I would sure like to see us make that difficult.
Mm-hmm.
One aspect might be that the controlled access lot has to be contiguous to or adjacent to the properties that share it, or something like that. Maybe if in some cases there might need to be allowed for a intervening roadway or something. That's about it.
Right, and I think there's probably some validity to having some sort of clause in there that says it needs to be owned and maintained by a neighborhood or a adjacent HOA, so that again it's related to a abutting or adjacent development, and not necessarily someone coming in just to use the lakeshore to create controlled access lots.
Yes. I'll leave it to you guys to
Marty,
try to figure out how to write that, but I think that's just very desirable protection.
Marty, this is Scott Stensland. Isn't that verbiage? I can't point directly to where it is, but I remember reading that in here, that it would need to be owned by the group or the HOA. I thought I saw that in here.
Yeah, I believe you are right. Where is that? Yeah, the lot must be jointly owned by all purchasers of lot in the subdivision or by all purchasers of non-riparian lots in the subdivision who are provided riparian rights on the access lot. So I think that is the intent of this, right? Maybe it needs a little bit more teeth in the language just to clarify that, but it does call for that being a part of a subdivision that is an amenity for the owners in that subdivision versus it being a standalone, almost commercial use at that point in time.
Marty, this is Ann Helsher again. I would maybe steer you to take a peek at the LMCD provisions regarding multiple dock licenses. Some of it may be relevant, some of it is not going to be relevant here. But instead of trying to, reinvent the wheel, it might at least give you some framework to start off with.
That's a really good idea. LMCD's been in this business for a long time. They've probably figured out a lot of good things. But Marty, I think the chief takeaway should be that, number one, I believe everybody on the water quality committee is in agreement with this for recreational development lakes, not necessarily general development, that the total number of moorings or whatever you want to call it be limited to something along the lines of what would be feasible if they were individual lots, assuming that the watercraft are individually owned. If they're jointly owned, then there might need to be further restriction, but that would probably come out of a PUD process. And secondarily, again, some kind of language that dictates that the access lot be contiguous, adjacent, or something to the properties that have rights to use it.
So I think if it pleases the commission and the committee, what I think I will do with this provision is we'll take a look at the LMCD multiple dock license and some of the language that's included in there, take in the feedback that you've provided. We do have an upcoming Lakes and Water Quality Committee meeting prior to the next Planning Commission meeting on this item. So we could bring a few different variations of verbiage as to what the Lakes and Water Quality Committee as a group would like to see, and hopefully come to some sort of consensus there, and then bring that consensus or recommendation to the Planning Commission the next time we talk about this. Does that work for everyone?
Yeah, good plan to me.
Hey, Marty, this is Steve Moan. Can I throw out another idea or thought with this? I grew up in the northern suburbs, and there are a lot of lakes up there where there are neighborhoods, and then there were neighborhood parks where the neighbors would go and they'd have some, but no one could moor a boat down there. There'd be a dock, and if they put their boat in for a day, they could use it. But you couldn't just store your boat there for days at a time. Is that something that we want to get towards on some of these small, more recreational lakes? Instead of having kind of like commercial docks, just neighborhood parks and kind of see what like Shoreview and Arden Hills have written up in their ordinances to that.
Yeah.
That's a good point. In fact, I think if you look at Chanhassen, I believe, has language to that effect. At least they did when I lived there 30 years ago. I suspect they still do. You might take a look at what they have. Again, I think they specifically prohibit overnight mooring or storage of power boats or docking, but they allow, beach access and potentially launching.
And even the people that live on the lake and have their own docks, they still belong to these neighborhood parks and pay their annual dues because they have like 4th of July picnics, Labor Day, Memorial Day, and they're just kind of a gathering spot.
Right. And we can certainly look into that, and I can touch base with our Parks and Recreation Director too, just to kind of get a sense of what they are looking at for future park development. And I think there is a desire to provide some sort of access. Again, we talked about access doesn't necessarily mean boat access, but some sort of public amenity on these different lakes. I do not know, however, though, if that would directly speak to this privately owned controlled access lot. So I think the question still remains whether or not is that something we'd want to allow? Do we want to look at not allowing it and in lieu of that doing something more public, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think Nolan really probably didn't mean to use the word park in the sense that it means to the city. He was just thinking it was a park-like setting, but was still a privately owned outlot. And again, that is definitely something that you could consider. And again, you could bring it to the next water quality meeting as an option. If you take a look at what Jen Hassan has, or what is in the area that, that Nolan spoke of, that precluded overnight mooring or storage.
Certainly.
Just want to confirm that was Steve, not Nolan.
Gotcha.
That's all right. My feelings aren't hurt.
It's kind of hard to tell here from the computer.
So what we will do is we'll do a little more research. We'll bring back a few different options at the next Lakes and Water Quality Committee meeting. Have you folks kind of talk through and see if we can come up with a recommendation that we can then bring back to Planning Commission. Chair Stensland, does that work for the Planning Commission side?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, so TBD on this section. So moving on, we get down into 6.4. This is talking about the ordinary high water line setback for structures and sewage treatment systems. Again, similar to the lot area and lot width requirements, we looked at keeping the existing city standards on the existing city limit lakes. So really the only different standard would be on those couple of recreational development lakes, because right now, natural environment lakes, what we have in our current city ordinance is the DNR standard. So that would be applicable across the board, whether developed or undeveloped. We do not have any general development lakes in the future growth area. So any reduced standards, again, not applicable. So it would really just be for those two recreational development lakes if we were to choose to continue to move forward with this approach of differentiating that the sewer structure would have a slightly less ordinary high water line setback in those undeveloped areas versus what would be in those developed areas. And then we do currently have a tributary setback, so that might speak to a little bit of our previous conversation about tributaries, not necessarily the impervious surface, but we do have a specific setback of 100 feet for tributaries, and this is in our current ordinance as well. Any questions with that?
Okay, I'm unmuted now, right?
Yes.
And I wanted to ask the Planning Commission members, you know, where their feelings are with regard to the changes that you've incorporated here that we suggested in terms of separating out the developed and undeveloped lakes. Are they on board with that?
Yeah, go ahead, Chair. I see you just unmuted.
Yeah, well, I'm just personally definitely on board with that. I think it makes great sense. I know listening to, I wasn't at the last meeting, but, you know, listening to the meeting and reading through the meeting notes, it seems like that was the unanimous decision. Marty, you can add to that.
Yeah, that was the consensus. Again, I'll let any commissioners who wish to speak for themselves, but that was what we took away as a consensus, is that we wanted to look at having some of that separation between our currently developed lakes and our undeveloped lakes. Everyone else is in stunned silence.
That means they agree.
Yeah, that works for me.
So for some of these, just I know we're getting a couple of hours in here. So some of these items that we are using the DNR model language, I'm just going to kind of scroll through if we don't have any red lines. But again, if there's things as you've done your research or review that you want to stop us and talk about, please do so. But as we continue down here, again, this is DNR model language related to the ordinary high water line setbacks for structures and sewage treatment systems, and basically says outside of that one water-oriented structure. This was something we talked about at a previous meeting, setback averaging, when we were considering having some reduced setbacks that precludes the a new home or a tear down and a rebuild on a lot with new standards being able to be closer to that water line. It's not as much of an issue anymore that we have adjusted those setback lines to be what the current standards are, but there is a calculation and a methodology for setback averaging in those instances where you've got some different setbacks on either side of those properties. This is speaking to decks, that it does allow some deck encroachment beyond that ordinary high water line setback, as long as it does not exceed 15%. And this, again, this was really just more of a trying to be in conforming with our existing definition of what a deck is. We don't necessarily define it as wood. So we move down here, we've got some additional structure setbacks related to bluffs, cemeteries, roadway right-of-ways, street right-of-ways. We've added in here our accessory structure setback. It is noted up in the accessory structure section, but thought it was relevant to include in this area. And then we did add, because the Shoreland ordinance does not necessarily speak to things like front yard and rear yard or side yard setbacks when they are not abutting the ordinary high water level. It's really more distance away from the water. We wanted to make sure that that in those cases we're just referring back to underlying zoning. So if you are in a shoreland overlay district that is R1 residential, we would use the shoreland standards where applicable and then revert back to those underlying zoning standards for things like front yard setback, that sort of thing. We've got our bluff impact zone section here talking about structures that cannot be placed within bluff impact zones. The height of structures, I think we've talked about a few times already. We are asking for some flexibility on that. Primarily just to avoid creating a number of non-conformities if that were to be reduced, because we're currently allowing 35 feet in height. We get into the section about lowest floor elevation and structures in the floodplain. This again, I think, speaks to those floodplain items and the controls that are in place for those and how things need to be built or where they need to be built related to the highest water level. We'll do a little more digging into this related to that floodplain item, just to make sure that this is all adequate, accurate.
Yeah, you'll find that information in the FEMA, and especially when you start to look at insurance and the demanded insurance when you're in that floodplain.
So again, this is still referring then to those methods of placement for those floodplain, lowest floor elevation type things. Structures are flood-proofed, that sort of thing. We've got some verbiage about significant historic sites. We get into water supply and sewage treatment, stating that it must meet the standards of the Minnesota Department of Health. And here is another line about the sewage treatment. Any premises used for human occupancy must be connected to a publicly owned sewer system where available. I'm not sure. It looks like we lost something here, or comply with nothing. So I've got to look and see, we must have inadvertently deleted something to see what that language said. You find something new every time you look at this. So I know I went through that section pretty fast before I move into section 7.0. Any questions on any of that? As I said, if any of this stuff wakes you up in the middle of the night, please feel free to reach out. So then we're moving into performance standards for public and private facilities. So this is where we're talking about roads and driveways and meeting structure setbacks, not being placed in bluffs and shore impact zones. Watercraft access ramps, again, same thing, talking about how and where they can be placed. Private facilities complying with grading and filling provisions, which is farther down, public roads and driveways, parking areas, stairways, lifts, and landings, how those are governed in these areas. Once we get to 7.3, this is where we have the design standards for those water-oriented accessory structures. So again, I think based on the direction of the Planning Commission at our last meeting, we were comfortable with the size requirements, location requirements as are provided by the DNR model ordinance. And it does look like the DNR does have, to your point, a limitation on the width of those parallel to the shoreline. So 7.38 actually says those can be a maximum of 20 feet. So to your point, Dick, is if someone wanted to do a 30 by 10 foot structure, the 10-foot side would need to be parallel to the lake.
I did not see anything in this about electrical and other things within that accessory building. Thinking of codes for electrical safety, you can, you can be electrocuted within 150 or even 300 feet of a building, if you have some kind of connection to the water.
Mm-hmm.
Dick, the National Electric Code does have some specifics about this. I don't think that the city has any other electrical requirements. I would suggest they leave that to the National Electric Code.
I don't have a problem with that, but I think that there ought to be mention that if they're talking about an accessory building, that's a different concern.
You might state that any permanent wiring in a accessory structure has to meet the National Electric Code.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you said that anywhere in your entire zoning ordinance for regular structures, but I know it's a requirement.
Yeah,
somewhere
and
it must be stated.
I believe that language is in our existing accessory structure code. I'll have to double check that. And we do refer back to that when dealing with these accessory structures, but we'll make sure that that's included some way, shape, or form.
Now, we had a discussion.
Be there, but I just don't know where to find them, so just thought I'd mention it. I've seen problems with electrocution that people aren't aware of, because if you have a short to a lake, you actually can be electrocuted within up to 300 feet away from it just by going in the water. And fresh water is much, much worse than what happens with salt water.
We did have some discussion at the water quality meeting about allowing some limited water and sewer sanitary functionality. And I did listen in on the Planning Commission meeting where, when that was brought up, it was quickly dismissed. And I think we maybe want to have a little more discussion about that.
Could the member remind us of that discussion?
The discussion we had in the committee meeting was that in many cases where there is a substantial distance and or height elevation change from the lake to the associated home, that there is a tendency to use the woods, and providing some form of better facility would benefit the lake. And it's also my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Marty, here, but the primary reason that plumbing and sanitary facilities are currently excluded, I think, from all accessory structures is to prevent them from being used as a living space. And if that's true, I've got to believe there is a way to preclude them from being used as a living space and still offer the option of a bathroom. And of course, the bathroom would have to meet all of the requirements. You know, it has to be done correctly. It can't be just a hole in the ground. And there's certainly going to be some potential construction challenges in terms of pumping the sewage up into the primary sewage facility, which may be higher typically. But those things, the mechanisms for doing that and the code requirements for that, I believe, are well established. So I'd like to, at some point, not necessarily tonight, but have that discussion with the Planning Commission and or City Council about the potential benefits of having sanitary facilities in a water accessory structure properly done.
Additional thoughts, feedback on that?
This is Councilmember Moore. Planning Commissioner Moore, sorry. So basically, didn't we discuss that there would be no plumbing with the intent of really preventing a restroom? I believe that was our discussion.
That is what I heard when I listened to the Planning Commission meetings discussion on it. But again, I don't believe, first of all, that the point was made that the rationale behind not allowing sanitary facilities in an accessory structure is to preclude them being used for living space. And I think we're all in agreement that the accessory structure shouldn't be used as living space. But I do believe that there is probably a way to write something that precludes that without eliminating the potential for a bathroom. And again, the issue I'm trying to raise here is that there are benefits to the lake and water quality in having properly installed sanitary facilities in a water accessory structure.
I'm assuming a good example might be like Big Island, where you find water levels around Big Island being unsanitary at sometimes based on the occupancy and there's the activity level around the lake. Is that a good comparison?
Probably. This is, of course, typically more private scenario than public, like Big Island. But there is a strong tendency for probably more the males of the species, but it can go both ways, to use the nearest bush or tree when there's no suitable alternative. And that just runs into the lake.
Paul, this is Marty. Do we currently allow plumbing and or water in our regular accessory structures? Is that an allowable use?
Well, one second. I don't believe so. I think you would need to apply for an ADU CUP.
Okay.
You know, maybe that's the appropriate way to do this, is to require a CUP to do that, but maybe that should be stated in here as an option. That way, each potential scenario, and there won't be many of them, would be individually evaluated.
Sorry, another question, Marty, again for Paul. What is our current standard setback for standard accessory structures? Is it whatever the rear yard setback is, or is it?
For accessory structures, it's 10 feet rear lot line, 6 feet side yard line, or the boundary of an easement.
Okay. Sorry, I was thinking through some things in my head, but I don't think what I was going to say would work.
So I'm going to just share a few thoughts. This is Planning Commissioner Moore. So I think from our previous discussions, the concern with having a restroom in an accessory structure was just the potential of flooding and, you know, a structure not being attended to in the event it wasn't lived in as a primary residence. Anyone is welcome to chime in on that. But my question, I don't mean to play devil's advocate, and please, I don't know the science behind this, but if you could inform us a little bit more about, like, if a gentleman, as you say, goes to the restroom in one of the bodies of water, does an occasional urination in the lake really impact water quality? That's truly just a question because I don't know the answer, and I'd appreciate any information on that.
Well, I would say it's hard to say what the impact would be. Certainly, if one person does it on an entire lake, that's not going to have much impact. But remember, these lakes are small, and if any significant number of residents partake in that particular form of relief, it could indeed have an impact. You know, perhaps what needs to be done here is just a little investigation into the possibility of regulating this in a way that works. Clearly, we don't want to create a situation that causes problems. But I'm not sure that the best answer is to just dismiss it.
Well, and I can add that to my list again, new list of questions for the DNR to see if there is any precedent for this. That may help us. If there is, then maybe there are some examples of potential language that would make that work, but I'll add that to my list to ask that question.
I am aware of, I believe, more than one what you would call a water accessory structure. They called them boathouses in those days on Lake Minnetonka that has plumbing facilities, but who knows if it's legal or grandfathered in or what.
This is Commissioner Pedersen, and my recollection from our last discussion was the technical difficulties of actually building a toilet in one of these structures and the extreme or better possibility of some sort of black water flow. If something doesn't work correctly, then that essentially toilet down by the water becomes a fountain of black water, which would be extremely detrimental to these small lakes. That was really my thought process on not wanting to have a indoor plumbing at one of these locations. And that's it. Thank you.
You know, that certainly makes sense. And again, if it were allowed, there would have to be construction standards that were met that precluded that possibility.
You know, I think we were looking at, okay, let's just avoid a disaster as much as anything. Thank you.
I will add that to my list to do some additional asking around. Like I said, I'll reach out to the DNR and see if there is any precedent for allowing that, or if it's even something that they would consider approving. But I'll do a little more homework and report at the next meeting.
This is Debbie just commenting quickly on that you think about, again, Mount Olivet Church, they have a porta potty they put down there, and that would be a way to control it. So if somebody wanted to have a place to go to the bathroom down by the lake, they could hire a service. Of course, it'd be a little tough to get it down there unless you have a ramp. But anyway, that's an option as opposed to building a toilet and trying to connect it to the sewer. Certainly couldn't connect it to the property. That's a big hill to try to pump it up to, but.
Yeah, personally, I would rather see a properly designed fixed installation of a porta potty. We want to talk about what happens if something floods out or tips over at a porta potty is a pretty prime example of something bad happening. Like,
I agree. I'm just saying that's a solution that they've done.
All right. So moving on then from accessory structures, this is the section that we've added in from our existing ordinance related to docks. We do govern docks in a different section of our city code, so that will be part of the thing I'll do a little more research and reviewing on as we talk about those controlled access things as well. And then also as Ann Olsher had noted that in the current code that any docks on Lake Minnetonka are controlled or governed by the regulations of the LMCD. So we've got that referenced in here as well. So moving on to 8.0, this gets into vegetation and land alterations. I know we've had some discussions and there's been some feedback about how to handle tree removal and tree preservation. As this current version of the document sits, we are essentially adding to the existing DNR model language about vegetation management, the reference to the city's tree preservation and replacement provision as well. I think we've mentioned, at least at Planning Commission, that this is another one of those ordinances that we are hoping to have a similar type discussion as we are with the Shoreland Management Ordinance with tree preservation, to look at that one to see if it's doing what we want it to do. But as this sits right now, I know there was some conversation about potentially not allowing payment in lieu of tree removal and requiring those be replaced. The current version of this does not incorporate that. It's really the DNR standards in addition to our tree preservation and replacement standards. So I know there's probably some discussion related to that.
well, I would add that tree preservation is a critical aspect of shoreline management. It's partially aesthetics, but it's also what holds the soil back and prevents erosion, et cetera. And I would certainly like to see, when we get to the PUD part, that option of paying for tree removal as opposed to mitigating it in new trees was off the table in a shoreline zone, or at the very least in the tier 1 of the shoreline zone.
Any additional comments, questions, feedback on this section?
There's one thing that I would note, and that's that we do want people to remove invasive species like buckthorn, which can be on the banks around the lakes and the tributaries. But there should also be a requirement then for replacing the vegetation so that we don't have sediment problems and erosion problems. So we don't want the buckthorn. It chokes out everything else. It is an invasive species. We do want that removed, but we still need to make sure that we don't have the erosion problems that can come from not having the appropriate vegetation. So somewhere in there, and that's just one example, but that's a fairly predominant one that's available right now. But we should be conscious of having some language in about removal of invasive species and replenishment with other vegetation.
Yeah, certainly anything we have shouldn't preclude removing invasives. I believe that buckthorn has a very minimal root structure, and removing the trees probably has very little negative impact on erosion. But it does sound like a good idea to say.
I guess you've never tried to pull out buckthorn roots before.
Oh, I have. The problem is they're very shallow. They don't get very deep. Anyway, I do kind of agree with you that whatever you're removing, it should be a good practice to replant something. But it wouldn't necessarily have to be trees. It could be other vegetation.
I would like to encourage maybe some kind of language that that motivates people to do that, because as this is written, there's no motivation for someone to remove buckthorn. If someone's building a home and their view is completely blocked of the lake because there's zero clearing of trees allowed, but if they can move trees around and accommodate the removal of buckthorn, it's something that I think we should be open to.
Yeah, the only thing I'm not opposed to allowing for some tree removal that's mitigated. I just want to preclude let's just remove the trees and pay money to the city in shoreland zones.
Agreed. I just think that we have to put a little teeth in it to allow people to really want to do it.
All right, I have that information noted. Moving down on the vegetation, here's where we talk about some of those grading and filling requirements. The DNR model language has some specific standards as to when an filling and or erosion permit is required. This is also something that we've talked about internally. Right now, the city does not have a filling and erosion permit that is readily accessible. I think it's something that, I think a permit was developed sometime last year, but with the staff turnover in the community development area, I don't know that it was ever completely made available and determined who was going to do the inspections and sign off on those things. So it's something internally that we are going to make sure if this is included as part of the ordinance, which I believe it will be, should be, is that we've got the mechanism in place to do that for those grading, filling permits. And then the watershed district, I think as Paul has mentioned earlier in the discussion, typically handles the erosion permits. So then section 8.33 is a long section of standards for grading, filling, and excavation. I have nothing specific to highlight in that section unless anyone has any questions. Some figures that speak to that. Then we move into stormwater management. Again, there are some general standards related to that. The previous iteration, and based on the Planning Commission discussion we had at the last meeting, we had a table in there for some impervious surface standards for uses outside of just a single residential lot. I know there was some question and concern about those. The DNR had also noted that they were not necessarily on board with some of the things that were noted in that impervious surface table. In my conversation with them this morning, we talked about this briefly, and the DNR's thought process on impervious surface is that they're willing to provide some flexibility when it comes to the central business district. So I think the downtown and our downtown west development of being able to allow essentially what we're proposing for master site plan and looking at different ways to manage stormwater management when it comes to that existing commercial business district. However, they're looking to retain in any of those residential districts, regardless of use, that 25% maximum impervious surface. And I think that is acceptable. So if there are any questions or concerns about that piece, we will likely look to do that on the next iteration.
Two things.
My only comment would be I'd like to make sure that we're using the latest up-to-date standards for stormwater, and that, you know, there were changes. I believe it's Atlas 4. It's now available to talk regarding climate change, how to do the modeling for stormwater. So, and I'm not sure if we're going to make any references to that kind of thing. Okay.
Paul, commission members, the two comments I'd like to make on that are, number one, I think I completely understand the need for some flexibility, as you call it, in the current business district. I would like to see that written up in such a way that it only applies to that specific area and wouldn't apply to a future business district type thing that might arise sometime in the future. In other words, you have a situation that just isn't going to fit the common mold here. A way to work around that. But I don't think it would be good to open up that level of flexibility, which could easily be abused to the detriment of the water quality in other places. So, you know, maybe it's create a special district or just define where this flexibility is going to apply to in the shoreline ordinance would eliminate that possible problem.
Commissioners and committee members, that was also something that was noted by the DNR in some previous conversation I had with them. So you will actually see within this version of the red line that when we are talking about commercial PUD, it is specifically referring to the existing central business district as it is zoned today.
Okay, and then the second comment I wanted to make is, I've stressed this in some other areas, but I think it's especially important here. Whatever flexibility you allow still needs to provide the same level of protection as the standard rules would have if you didn't have the flexibility. I understand that you need to be able to deal with things differently, but the end result needs to be the same in terms of amount of runoff, the rate of runoff, pollutant loading, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, you can have more impervious surface, but you got to treat it appropriately.
Yep.
I think that should be codified in the whatever flexibility you put in here.
All right. Any other questions, comments related to impervious surface or stormwater? All right, we are getting close to the end. Thank you all for the good discussion and your patience as we slog through this. But it's important stuff, so I think this is a good discussion. But we are nearing the end. So Section 9 gets into the subdivision and platting provisions. Again, this initial section is related to the purpose and land suitability, talking about some suitability analysis within the shoreland, etc. We get down into controls and water and sewer design standards. Again, you'll not see a lot of deviation from the DNR model ordinance. One piece is the topographic contours. The DNR model calls for 10. Our standard is 2-foot intervals, so we wanted to make sure that that remains standard in this area. Another minor change, you will see that we've changed the subdivision process, so the full platting process from 5 to 4. So anything that creates 4 or more lots, again, that is consistent with our subdivision process. Right now, we consider anything less than 4 as a minor subdivision, so it's not doesn't go through the same standards as the full platting process for those larger divisions. So again, this was made for consistency, actually reducing that number that triggers the platting process. And then this is just a reference to those controlled access lots. So not a lot of deviation in this section 9. Any questions before we move into the PUD piece? All right, so residential PUDs. So this is something, again, that has changed a bit significantly since the original red line was provided, based on some planning commission discussion. Primarily, it has reverted back to DNR standards as it relates to residential PUD. As you'll recall, we had proposed some shoreline dedication in lieu of the amount of public open space dedication. Based on that discussion from last planning commission meeting, we've kind of reversed course on that and gone back to the standard DNR standard as we address these residential PUDs. So as we kind of click through this section, they had a very prescriptive process for PUDs here that is very similar, if not identical, to what we already call out in our zoning code for the PUD process. So essentially what is required of those plans and plats. So we are just, again, referring to, from the procedure standpoint, back to our typical PUD procedure as to the things that we need to get. And then when you really get down into the nuts and bolts of it, that's when we get into these density determinations. At our last planning commission, we kind of walked through some examples of what that looks like and how that tiering breaks out. Again, this is all based on the DNR standards with just some additional clarification that we're referring to all tiers or these other lakes, whereas general development has a different measurement for its first tier as opposed to its other tiers. So we've maintained that calculation and the steps to be able to determine that. This section here that is redlined out is, again, related to those commercial PUDs. A lot of that, as I mentioned earlier, related to more of the resort and cottage type commercial developments. So did not appear to be applicable to what we're trying to do for residential PUDs. So that has been struck in this red line. And then that gets down into that step 4 of those steps for determining the density calculations. And then this is where we get into the sections where we've reverted back to the DNR model language related to the structure setbacks, the way that they have the verbiage noted, the design criteria as we get to open space requirements down here. So requiring that 50% of the total project area, the items that it must include. As I referenced earlier when we were talking about this, that they do require a protection or open space, not necessarily dedication, but needs to be left as open space either through public dedication or through covenant or deed. 70% of that shore impact zone. I think one thing that is important to note as we look at how this changes from what we've previously discussed. So instead of that 150 feet of shoreline dedication, the way the DNR has it, it's governed through this shore impact zone. And if we were to go all the way back up to the definitions for shore impact zone, that is an area that is 50% of the ordinary high water line setback for buildings. So for example, if you're talking about a natural environment lake, which has 150 foot setback, building setback, that shore impact zone is 75 feet. So when they're talking about the open space requirement needing to be 70% of that shore impact zone, you're talking about 70% of that 75 feet in a natural environment lake setting. And then same calculation if you're looking at recreational development or general development lakes. And that can be, you know, as I mentioned, be done as a shoreline dedication for a portion of that shoreline. It can be done through covenants similar to the Waterford development, where they are requiring that they are maintaining that as natural open space. So yeah, that's the most significant change from the last time we discussed this. Otherwise, again, the rest of these are DNR model language as it relates to maintaining that open space, administration, etc. I think instead of me blabbing through all this, I'll turn it back over for questions and comments. I'm sure you've all reviewed this section. Probably have some feedback, so we can call out any items that you wish to discuss further.
Probably the biggest concern I have is the 50% density increase in the first tier. That has pretty huge impact on the characteristic of the shoreland. I think once you get back to the second tier, it's less critical, and I wouldn't be opposed to density increases that the DNR allows, but 50% increase is pretty significant at the shoreline. Seems like first tier ought to just not allow that. Maybe you make up for it with a little more back in the fourth or fifth tier. And secondly,
and you do. Oh, go ahead.
I'm confused about the 1062 open space requirements. That it says it must consist of at least 50% of the village project area and must include. How would it adding the fact that it must include physical areas with physical characteristics unsuitable for development? Is that trying to say that you can't modify areas that are unsuitable for development and they must be left natural? Or is that just saying that if you've got areas that aren't suitable for development, you can include them in the 50%?
I believe it is the latter. I think if you look at the section A and B, they're essentially saying that these items for sure constitute part of your 50%. So those unsuitable for development in their natural state would be, you know, in my mind, referring to the wetlands, any unbuildable bluff areas. So that first A is saying these are the areas that have to be included, and then section B is areas that they're saying you could also include as part of that calculation. So I believe your latter interpretation is accurate.
Well, then it seems like there isn't any protection being offered with this. I'm not sure what the benefit is to requiring open space and then say, well, as long as if you've got areas that can't be built, that constitutes 50% of the property, then you could build on 100% on the rest of it. But
it does also, I think where that additional protection comes in is when you're looking at that shore impact zone. So if you're looking at 3A, it would be 1062A, 3A, that 70% of that shore impact zone has to be constituted as part of that 50%. So if you've got 50% of your property as wetland, you still have to dedicate that 70%, or not necessarily dedicate, but protect that 70% of the shore impact zone, because that's something that must be included.
Okay, that sounds more like the first interpretation of 1062A then, is that any areas that meet these criteria have to be left as open space.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry. I may have misheard or misinterpreted what you asked originally. But yes, I mean, those are areas that must constitute and then can be used towards your 50% calculation.
Okay.
And
then back to my earlier question, back at 1054, I'd like to hear from the Planning Commission about their thoughts on at least reducing that 50% to 25%, if not to zero in the first tier, perhaps making up for it by increasing the fifth tier or fourth tier.
You know, this is Planning Commissioner Moore. Marty, do you have the ability to pull up a tier map or a visual?
Yeah, I actually have. So the slides that I've actually got another kind of real world example I can show too as we talk through this. So I think one of the things to consider when it comes to the tiering, especially when you are talking about the 70% of that shore impact zone, there is also a requirement that structure setbacks need to be increased at least 50% greater than the minimum setback, or 25% greater if there is an equivalent amount of vegetative management, topography, et cetera. So when you're talking about those shore impact zones, you're talking about the setbacks and then the additional setbacks, as well as that 70% dedication or protection of those areas. You're really pushing that density pretty far away from the shoreline. So while it may be within that first tier, it's really relatively far from where that shoreline is. I'm going to show you an example of something that I put together. This is an older plat, something that was sketched, I think, in 2015 for the Meat Cutters property. So ignore what is being shown in here. This is not an active proposal. It's just something that I knew was public and was relevant. So I've tried to put some lines onto this. So what you can kind of see here on this property, which is along Marsh Lake Road, which would be a natural environment lake, you'd have your 75-foot shore impact zone, which is essentially here, again, assuming that this is truly the ordinary high water line. I don't know in reality if that is the case, but assuming this is the ordinary high water line, you've got your shore impact zone of 75 feet. You then have your 150-foot building setback with your, let's say you were even going to do the vegetative management, so you could do a 25% increase to that. You're looking at a building setback of 187 from that ordinary high water line. So you're looking at this green line as that building setback. So it's really pushing, and you can kind of see, it's hard to see where that first tier is. So I think here, in fact, I think it's this pink line along where my mouse is. You can see that even with the building setback lines and things, that first tier doesn't even allow for any houses to be built there.
Marty,
so just again, something to consider when you're talking about the tiering.
Isn't the first tier, at least as written, going to be 287 feet from the ordinary high water mark? So if the building setback line is 187, you've got 100 feet left.
Yeah.
And again,
I think
what I'm looking for is the very front line of the structures shouldn't be high density, which, I mean, you can kind of see the impact here. I mean, this is basically a wall of buildings along the shore, and it would make much more sense from my perspective from in the preserving of the characteristics of our lakes to say that that extra density comes behind that first row. Or at least no more than 25% of it.
Other thoughts, questions, feedback on that approach?
I just concur with what Lance just said.
This is Chair Stensland. Yeah, I agree with well, whether it was Dick or Lance, one of the two. I think that front line should be not as dense.
And again, I think in terms of the developer's ability to develop the property, you can end up with the same total number of units if you just push up density increase allowed in the 4th or 5th tier and take it away from the 1st tier.
So I'm going to jump back to our draft ordinance here, so we can kind of look at what those numbers are and see if we can get some direction on how we want to amend this. So the way the DNR standard is that you are allowed that 50% bonus density in that first tier, 100, 200, 200 as you go on. Am I hearing that we want to reduce this either to 25 or less and then increase what is allowed in the 2nd tier by that equivalent amount?
I was thinking the 3rd or 4th tier, but
okay.
Probably doesn't matter much if it's 2nd, 3rd, or 4th.
So just for an example, if we were to say 1st tier allows 25, 2nd tier 125, 3rd tier 200, so on.
Yeah, I think that would work for me.
My only feedback is that this is a little counterintuitive in that we were being open-minded to a little more density for undeveloped bodies of water for residential development going forward. This marsh lake would be one of those lakes undeveloped, and so that kind of goes against what we've discussed.
Well, if the total density of the property still allows the same number of building sites, just fewer along the shore, and actually to some extent that might provide a view for for the 2nd row if you didn't block everything off on the 1st row.
And it really would be.
I just have a quick question for Dick. I'm just curious on his thoughts. This is Scott Stensland. So if we took basically Marty and your recommendation here, and we went from 50 to 25, and you in the 1st tier, and you boost that 25 additional in the 2nd tier, so you go up to 125. Aside from a view, how does that impact water quality? My initial thought is you got 25 right next to that tier 1. That additional 25 is moving it. That the distance is going to make that much of a difference on the water quality of the lake.
I wouldn't expect it to be a huge impact. There would be some. It's more a function of how much impervious surface you have, and I think that's still constrained pretty well. But you also have to consider that almost inevitably, the closer you are to the lake, the more runoff is going to go directly in the lake without treatment. If you have runoff coming from 500 feet away from the lake, it's theoretically coming through vegetation and being buffered by that 500 feet of intermittent vegetation, whereas when you're closer to the edge, you get less of that. But again, I think a big driving factor here for me is
is the aesthetics character that we have on our lakes, that packing in everything you can right on the shoreline is detrimental to. Now,
this is Terry Schwarting. It just seemed like we were really trying to embrace the DNR model, and we felt it had sufficient protections. I assume the DNR is just as concerned about water quality as your committee, right?
you might be right, you might be wrong.
I would not agree with that comment.
Nor would I.
Keep in mind that the DNR's thinking is very heavily influenced by conditions across the entire state, not just urban areas. And urban areas have a much greater issue with residential runoff than outstate. So I would disagree with the notion that their standard protections are sufficient for the kind of density that we have in the urban lake development areas.
And you can look at their showcase properties as well, and they have more in line with the standards that Victoria currently is. Their minimum standards are just that, minimum standards, and Victoria is just not a DNR minimum standards city.
So let's get back to the concerns on the other side. Are we concerned that this would limit development some way if we push move half of the density increase in the first tier and put it into the tiers behind that?
I think it's contingent on the property and the size of the parcel. That meat cutters property that we just kind of showed as an example is a challenging one because of the road right-of-way constraints to the north and narrow. So I think actually when that has been tiered out in the past, you only end up with 2 tiers total across that whole property. If you've got narrower properties and you're pushing some of the allowable building up, is whether the land can actually, because I think there is a calculation in this PUD that says, okay, here's the number, but then you have to do a calculation to see if you've actually even got enough land to be suitable for that number. So that would, again, I think it's predicated on the parcel and the size and the configuration.
But also in that well-constrained site, you would have the opportunity to increase the second tier by an additional 25%. So even there, you're going to end up with the potential for the same number of units.
Right, if you physically got the space in the second tier, correct?
Yep. And I guess I would argue that if you don't, then maybe it's not suitable for that level of development.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and what you can look at is say, if there were 4 tiers, right? But what happened is that you have another roadway that's assumed that is actually covering that 3rd tier and not allowing construction. What is the impact of the runoff and everything else from that impervious surface that's back in that 3rd tier? And that gets back to the suitability of the parcel. Just because it's sandwiched between a lake and a roadway, doesn't mean that you should be allowed to squeeze everything in there, and squeeze more things in there than you would otherwise normally do. I mean, take a look at that Marsh Lake thing again and realize that you've got a large impervious surface that's sitting there in what might be your 3rd and 4th tier if it was, truly open back from the lake.
Looking at that particular plat sketch, it's hard to believe that it actually meets the impervious surface limitations.
Yeah, and again, I can't speak to any of that. That was a 5-year-old sketch. Again, something knowing the property, I wanted to find something that has already been publicly used. So.
But again, to main point here, it doesn't appear that even in that fairly challenging site, pushing the extra 25% out of the first tier into the second tier would significantly impact the developability.
I'm going to play devil's advocate just for the fun of it. I think you could say the same thing about the impact of the lake by pushing the, 25 homes into the second tier. I think it's hard to prove that it wouldn't have the same impact as having those 50 houses in tier 1.
Well, again, the further the houses and impervious surface are from the lake, the more opportunity there is for the natural vegetation to filter the nutrients and other runoff, is undesirable runoff, and slow down the runoff. And again, typically there's going to be some slope back from the lake, and the farther back you go, the less slope there usually is. Now, there may be exceptions to that, but then your whole bluff thing comes into play.
This is Ann Helsher.
Yeah, and I'm not disagreeing. I'm not disagreeing. I'm just
bringing up the point.
Throwing that out there. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm just suggesting that maybe we just note the options at this point and move forward, and maybe the council decides, or we have more discussion on this later.
Yeah, I don't know that we need to solve it tonight, but I'd like at least to see that brought forward as an option of reducing that first tier to 25 and the second tier to bringing that up to the 125.
Noted.
I would agree with that also. And then I think with Waterford Landing, there was some requirements of what kind of vegetation that would help to filter the runoff and slow the speed of that runoff. So there's probably in this PUD type of situation, those standards put in there somewhere else as well.
Theoretically, that's what 8 or B2 here is supposed to be about. But there's not much prescribed, just a very general statement. Although it is actually written in a way that makes some sense, that the proposed vegetative management or topography change is intended to provide an equivalent amount of protection that you would get if you had the lower density. That applies to all the tiers. So I think I think that's good.
Anything else related to residential PUD? Again, this section that is removed from here is related to conversions from rental resort type properties into residential properties, which is not applicable for us, which is why it has been removed.
The only other thing that I'd like to see put in here is to give the Planning Commission and the council some actual teeth, is to state fairly clearly that whatever concessions are made in the PUD process, the result has to provide the same level of protection that development without any variation would provide in terms of stormwater runoff and pollutant loading, etc. Pretty sure that's the intent here, but it's not clearly called out. And I know in the past we've had some issues when a developer wanted to do something and there was no legal specificity that would allow you to deny what they wanted to do.
All right. And the last section that we have in here again is pretty brief, speaking to the commercial PUD process. We are, as part of my conversation with the DNR this morning, I did ask them to let us know if there was some guidance on any baseline standards related to this or some protections that we should consider putting in. So I'm hoping to receive some of that as part of their feedback. But I think we've talked through the commercial PUD, at least the intent of what we'd like to do with that commercial PUD relatively extensively, and that we're looking for some flexibility while maintaining or not sacrificing some of those shoreland protections. And again, making this specifically prescribed to the central business district zoning district. Any additional questions, comments, or thoughts on the commercial PUDs? Hearing none, Chair Stensland, that gets us to the end of the red line ordinance. I've got a number of notes and things that I'll take away for the next time, but I will turn it back to you.
Okay. With that in mind, we're going to move on. Before we do that, I would, on behalf of the Planning Commission, just like to thank the Shoreland Management Ordinance, or excuse me, the Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee. You folks, all of you are obviously experts. We appreciate your thoughts and concerns. And, I'm, myself, even playing devil's advocate sometimes, I just like to throw that out there. But all your thoughts and everything you've contributed, we absolutely appreciate. So thank you very much. Look forward to working with you further on this as we take our baby steps. Thank you. Okay. We're going to move on then. We have miscellaneous. And I know Paul and Marty, I believe staff has one item tonight for miscellaneous.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, Commissioners. Just really quickly, we did get a request in from a resident who would like the city to consider amending its requirement on the height of fences around swimming pools. Currently, the city of Victoria has a 5-foot requirement that has been in place for quite some time. I couldn't tell you when that was initially put in place. But they've indicated some concerns or questions, I guess, as to why that 5-foot standard is the standard when there is some national building standards and ICC code standards that have those set at 4 feet. We did also get some additional information today that the, what is the organization? I apologize. Commissioner Schwarting, maybe you can speak on the item since you sent it over related to the standards.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the organization, but it was relative to pool safety. And it clearly stated that, yes, the 4-foot fence is the standard, but a 5-foot fence would be preferable. So they were certainly recommending from a safety standpoint that 5 feet would be better than 4.
So I think we're not trying to make any decision on that today. I did want to just bring it up in the miscellaneous section to see if it was something the commission wanted us to further look into, or whether we felt that the 5-foot standard was adequate as we have it. So just looking for some direction on whether that's something you'd like to see as a regular agenda item at a future meeting.
I know for myself, this is Chair Stensland, we may have looked at the same thing, Terry. I looked at a few different websites, and the one that stood out, U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission, in regards to pools, and they basically have the same recommendation you mentioned. Fences should be a minimum of 4 feet high, although fences 5 feet high are preferable. Some of their facts are pretty astounding when you look at child deaths in the United States. Also, in addition to deaths, just submersion injuries. I'm interested to hear what the rest of the group opinion is, but I know myself, I don't really have an appetite to revisit this. I think, our 5 foot is safe. I don't think it's extra. It's not out of ordinary. I like it, but I'm interested in what the other folks have to say.
I think it'd be I understand from reading. That would be for.
I think Commissioner Brownlee is dancing. You're breaking up a little bit, Commissioner Brownlee.
Sorry, Nick.
I don't know if he's still trying.
It looks like he's muted. His mic.
It looks like he's muted. Any other comments from the group?
I have a question that I was trying to figure out, and I did some research and I just couldn't quite find the answer. So the perimeter of the backyard, the fencing, is supposed to be 4 feet, correct? But then an additional fencing around the pool is supposed to be 5 feet. Is that the assumption?
No, the Commissioner Moore, Chair, Commissioners, the requirement is 5 foot around a pool. Now that can be a property fence. So if you've already got a 5 foot fence around your property, you meet the guidelines for a fence around a pool. And if it's currently unfenced, then again, there needs to be that 5 foot fence around the pool, but it doesn't necessarily need to be directly around the pool. It can be around the property. Is that accurate, Paul?
Correct.
So to summarize, if you have a 4 foot fence and you have a pool installed later, the 4 foot fence would comply. Is that a true statement?
No.
Okay.
No, it would need to either be extended, based on the current ordinance, it would either need to be, that fence would need to be extended up a foot to meet the 5 foot fence, or yes, you'd have to add and you probably wouldn't do this aesthetically, but you'd have to add another 5 foot fence inside that fence around the pool.
Hello? Scott, can you hear me?
I think we can hear you now, Commissioner Brown.
Yep, I can hear you this time. Sounds good.
Okay. All I was saying is I think it'd be while revisiting this, my understanding from their application was that they were in the height of consistent fences around them. I don't know what this area look like, but I think it'd be well, and probably if there's people who are petitioners that we let's have a discussion if you can really not. That's all I'm saying.
Breaking up, we didn't get that. Or I didn't get that.
Yeah, Commissioner Brownlee, I'm sorry. I think I don't know that we were able to understand what you were saying there. We had some breakup issues.
I agree. This is Commissioner Kuehne. I agree that I think it should stay at a 5 foot height. But also, I know our HOA, we are in a fenceless neighborhood, and the pool fences have to surround the pool. They cannot surround the property. But that's just an HOA rule. But they still are required to be 5 feet high. So I don't know that I would agree with staff pursuing it.
I would agree, especially since it's the perimeter fencing. It's not like it's an additional fencing around the pool.
So I actually just received an email from Commissioner Brownlee since he's having some issues. He says he was just saying that he thinks that we should revisit this. The applicant should be heard, is his comment.
Is this something that has to go through planning, or can they bring it up to a city council meeting and?
No, I mean, it's something that we do have a zoning code amendment process or permit that they can submit through if they'd like to further pursue this. Again, in my conversations with the property owner, I said that I first wanted to just touch base with the Planning Commission to see if it's something that we wanted to look at from a city perspective as to whether or not that we want to make that change. I think they still have some opportunity if they want to make a formal request to look at that. We'd have a process or procedure we'd go through. The other option that would be available to the specific homeowner who provided the feedback would be request for a variance, although I don't know. Again, that would be up to the commission to determine whether or not that request met the requirements of the variance, but that is another option that they would have to look at.
Yeah, well, and I don't think there's any harm. I mean, if staff feels, I know we're building a lot of pools right now in the city, and if you feel that it's reasonable to, you know, kind of do a comparison to other cities, neighboring cities, and you know, take a look at that and bring it to us with more information, I think everybody would be open to that. But I know you're busy at the same time, saying you got a lot to do, especially with the what we're working on right now. You know, personally, I'm not opposed to you know, putting that work in to look at that, but.
And we did do just a very quick comparison, just when this request came in, just to kind of see were we out of line, were we not out of line. I'd have to pull up that document right now, but if my memory serves me correctly, I think we looked at like 20 or 25. It must have been 25 or more cities, because there was a variation between 4 foot, 5 foot, and 6 foot. And I believe the majority were at 4 foot. I think 14 of that, of the number that we looked at, were at 4 feet. Sorry, I should have had this prepared. If you give me 1 second, I can pull that up. So it looks like we looked at, actually it's more than I thought it was. We were at about 30 cities. And of those, 19 were at 4 foot, 9 were at 5, 1 was at 6 feet. So we did do just a quick comparison just to see where we were at. Again, it is not unusual to see that 5 foot standard, but it does look like, at least the communities we've looked at, a majority of them are at that 4 foot standard.
Yeah. How many requests do we get in per year to move it to 4 feet, roughly?
Oh, Paul, you probably could speak to that better than I can. I know just in the last couple of months, we've had at least 2 or 3.
Well, so Commission and Chair, we have received 1 request to change it, or maybe 2 requests to change it. But with the 1 request that was made, they had an above ground pool, and staff had come to the determination that the pool was 4 feet high, and they were going to put a 1 foot perimeter around the pool itself, which gave them the 5 feet. So that problem ended up resolving itself. The other one was a situation where the fence exists currently, and so they're having an issue with trying to tie in the rest of the fence. you know, I just don't see a lot of requests for augmenting the rule. It's more about, well, how do we make the rule work? And how do we accomplish the rule is the question. So like, do we put latticing on top of it and those sorts of things. A lot of these homes already have 6-foot fences because most folks buy the cedar dog-eared 6-foot fence, which is pretty standard in most designs. So a 4-foot fence just doesn't happen very often. It's rarely applied for.
And I know, Paul, how many pools, just this year, how many pools have been put in the city of Victoria?
Chair, Commission, I'd say roughly 7 or 8 up to date. Plus we have 2 or 3 pending currently, and then, you know, more will come in the pipe shortly.
This certainly open for discussion, and I absolutely appreciate Commissioner Brownlee's, you know, everybody needs to be heard, but I'm not sure we, you know, for the amount of, for two requests and one was handled by itself, I'm not sure this is would be a great use of staff's time, considering how busy they are right now with the lakeshore that we're working on. I think, like in the case of the resident that submitted this last request, where you have an issue where there's a real issue of tying in maybe an existing fence to some new fence, that's probably an issue that just, you know, a one-off that needs to come to us and we can discuss it. That's my thought. And again, folks, help me. What do you think? I'd like to know your opinions. I can't look at anybody right now. It's frustrating. I can look you in the eye. You don't talk.
Well, this is Terry Shorting. I think they can bring it forward. It sounds like they already have a 4-foot, I'm going to guess, chain link fence maybe, and they just want to not spend any more money, and they're putting a pool in, or they could keep the existing fence and then put the 5-foot fence around the pool area, but just purely trying to save some money, which I can understand their desire, but.
Well, and I wouldn't even go that far. I don't want to make assumptions on this for this individual. There could be many different reasons. But
the comments were the aesthetic to the other fences in the neighborhood, which were, they must have adjoining fences with neighbors. So they have a perimeter fence.
Gotcha.
That's what I got out of their feedback.
That's true. I don't have it in front of me, but I did read that. Yeah, I just think that's something, you know, it seems like a one-off that probably should come to us. Instead of changing the entire city for what sounds like this year anyways, one resident. And we can hear them. I mean, this is the mechanism for them. Bring it to us and we can discuss it. And there may be a valid reason and we grant them a variance on that.
Sounds appropriate.
That's the process. Yeah, I think personally, I think that would be the appropriate, and I would recommend that to the resident to bring it to us and it would be 100% appropriate and get approved. But I think to direct staff to look at this for the entire city might be a little overzealous at this point.
So
I agree with your direction.
Am I hearing then consensus of we don't want to further pursue at this point in time an ordinance change, but that the Planning Commission would be open to hearing a variance request if the property owner so chose? I'm seeing some
That would be
nodding
my
heads.
wish. Yeah, there's nodding head here.
Yes.
I totally agree. This is a variance issue and that's our job.
All right. That is what we will do. We will not further pursue any ordinance change, and we'll let the property owner know that if they wish, they can submit a variance request.
Awesome. Okay, so that
Commissioner Brownlee
yeah.
agrees with that as well. I just got another email from him. Commissioner Brownlee agrees with that as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Brownlee. Appreciate that. I think it's reasonable. Any other miscellaneous items tonight?
Yes, this is Dick. I just had one thing I'd like to request. I know that there's being studies done for Highway 5 and what improvements are going to take place longer term, and I would like to see it added as a future item to just give an update on the status for changes. It should have, I would think, dramatic changes for downtown, and I know it's going to have impact on water. And then the second item I just wanted to give you an alert to is that there is going to be highway construction on Highway 7 on the north side of Lake Zumbra that is going to reduce it to a single lane. And I'm anticipating that the city of Victoria will see some rerouting of traffic down County 11 and into downtown. Just an awareness factor that the erosion on the banks of Highway 7 were starting to undercut the highway, and they needed to make changes as to what was going on to protect it. And that there are meetings scheduled, virtual meetings being scheduled to provide information about that.
Perfect. Thanks, Dick. Commissioners, any other miscellaneous items tonight? Hearing none. Paul or Marty, any additional items from you?
None for me.
None for me.
Yeah, to both of you, as Mary Jo said earlier, I would also like to thank you. I think the way you laid everything out is a good way to go through this, especially when we have a couple different groups and a lot of people. So I thank you for that. Obviously, you put a lot of time into it. Good job. That being said, if there's no more items, commissioners, remember to state your name first, but do I have a motion to adjourn?
Gaur so moves gratefully.
Thank you.
Terry, good morning. I second that motion.
Wow, I didn't even, that happened fast. Thank you. I have a motion made by Commissioner Gaur, seconded by Commissioner Schwarting. I will take a roll call, final roll call of the evening to all of your, you're all happy. Commissioner Brownlee, let's look for that email.
I don't know if procedurally this can count, but I did get an email that he says aye on adjourn.
We're gonna count that. If you hold it up, to the screen, we can see it. We'll count it. Commissioner Kuehne.
Aye.
Commissioner Gaur.
Aye.
Commissioner Pedersen.
Aye.
Commissioner Moore.
Aye.
Commissioner Schwarting.
Aye.
Chair Stensland, aye. And it's good to see that you're all still there. So thank you very much. Motion carries. We are adjourned.